Rain fell like ash over the old stockyard, soft and steady, blurring the edges of the world. The pens were half empty, the air thick with the smell of rust, hay, and resignation. Thomas Ellery stood near the gate, collar turned up, watching the auctioneer rattle off numbers like prayers no one believed in anymore. He hadn't come to buy. He'd come to sell an old plow, one more piece of a life shrinking by degrees. Yet his eyes kept drifting to the back pen, where a small, frail mare stood apart from the others, her coat caked with mud, her ribs showing to like the lines of a map to nowhere. She barely moved. Only her ears flicked when men shouted, when boots struck metal. There was something in her stillness that made Thomas pause. Something that wasn't fear exactly, but a kind of weary surrender. He'd seen it before, in soldiers who had lost too much, in the mirror after his wife's funeral. The auctioneer called her Lot 37, unbroken, lame on the left, no papers. A few chuckles rippled through the crowd. Won't pull a cart, won't breed. Let's start at 50. No one raised a hand. Thomas didn't know what he was doing until his arm went up. The crowd turned, murmuring. The man beside him muttered, "You'll be feeding her to the crows." Thomas said nothing. The gavel fell at $30, the sound echoing like a shot in the rain. He signed the paper, his name smudging in the wet ink, and walked toward the pen. When he opened the gate, the mare didn't shy away. She just looked at him, eyes dark and hollow, and for a moment he felt as if she were studying him too. "Easy," he whispered, his voice rough from disuse. "You've done your fighting, haven't you?" She let him place the halter, without protest. Her bones felt too light beneath his hand, her breath shallow but steady. As they walked toward the trailer, thunder rolled somewhere distant, the smell of storm swelling in the air. Behind him, someone called, "Ellery, you'll never get her through winter." He didn't look back. He only said quietly, "Maybe she needs to see one first." He tied her gently, tossed a warm blanket over her flank. As he fastened the latch, lightning flared, slicing through the rain. For an instant, he saw something burn faintly into her hide beneath the grime, a crescent and a star intertwined, like some forgotten mark. Then it vanished into shadow. He frowned but said nothing, climbing into the truck. The road home was long and empty, the kind of road that let thoughts wander too far. In the mirror, he caught a glimpse of her in the trailer, head bowed, unmoving. "Grace," he murmured without meaning to, testing the name against quiet. The wind carried it away, but the mare lifted her head, as if she'd heard him after all. Morning came pale and cold, the fields wrapped in mist like breath held too long. Thomas led the mare from the trailer, her hooves sinking into the mud. She stumbled once, then steadied herself, blinking at the low hills that ringed the farm. It wasn't much, just a sagging barn, a small house, and fences held together by faith and wire, but it was quiet, and quiet was a mercy. He opened the stall door, spread hay, and set a bucket of warm mash nearby. She didn't eat it first, only watched him, unblinking, as if trying to decide whether he was another man who'd asked too much. He worked around her in silence. Years of habit made his movements gentle, deliberate. When he brushed her coat, the mud came away in dark clumps, revealing scars along her flank. Old, healed, but deep. He found a faint mark again, the crescent and star pressed into the skin like a memory that refused to fade. He ran his thumb over it, wondering who had branded her and why. The symbol stirred something at the edge of recollection, but the thought slipped away before it took shape. At dusk, the house felt emptier than usual. He made coffee, poured some into a chip mug, and stood by the window watching the barn light sway. The wind rattled the eaves. He remembered his wife's voice then, soft, steady, full of belief in small kindnesses. Eleanor had once said that saving anything broken was a way of saving yourself. He'd laughed at the time. Now, he wasn't sure it wasn't true. The next morning, the mare was waiting by the gate. She whinnied once, quiet but certain. Thomas smiled despite himself and fetched her a handful of oats. "You're hungry after all," he said, and she stepped closer, trusting him enough to breathe against his sleeve. The touch startled him. It had been so long since anything had reached for him first. Days passed like that, slow, deliberate, stitched together by routine. He fixed the barn roof, mended the fence, spoke to her as he worked. Sometimes she answered with a sound that wasn't quite a whinny, more like a sigh. He began calling her Grace, the name he'd spoken on the road. It fit. One evening, as he brushed her mane, his brush caught on something knotted deep in her coat. He pulled free a small fragment of leather, old, brittle, stamped with the same crescent and star. His breath caught. He remembered Eleanor's childhood photograph, tucked in an old album somewhere upstairs, a little girl standing beside a chestnut mare with that same mark. He looked at Grace, heart hammering. "No," he whispered, half to himself. "It can't be." But she lifted her head then, eyes bright under the lantern light, and for the first time since he brought her home, she took a step toward him, steady and sure, as though she already knew the answer he could not yet say aloud. Snow fell that night, soft as dust, veiling the fields in silence. Thomas sat by the fire with a photograph open on his knee, the one of Eleanor as a child, smiling beside a mare so like Grace it felt impossible. The brand matched perfectly, crescent and star gleaming in the sepia light. He traced the image with trembling finger, his breath shallow, thoughts tangled between grief and disbelief. Could this horse truly be the same one from decades past? Time made no sense when loss blurred its edges. He told himself it couldn't be, but the truth pulsed quietly beneath denial, waiting to be named. The next morning, he found Grace standing at the gate again, snow crusted on her mane. Her eyes followed him as he worked, patient, unjudging. Something in that gaze unsettled him, like being seen by someone who remembered who he used to be. When he spoke to her now, he didn't bother hiding the ache. "She used to talk about you," he said softly, "about a horse that ran fast in the wind, that carried her away from everything bad." Grace's ears twitched at his voice. He almost laughed at himself for believing she understood. Later, while sorting through the attic for firewood, Thomas found an unopened envelope tucked inside an old ledger. The paper was yellowed, edges curled, addressed to Eleanor Ellery. His heart thudded. He opened it with care. Inside was a letter from a lawyer, formal, distant, confirming the sale of Moonfire Ranch after the death of Eleanor's father. The note mentioned an unaccounted-for mare, Aurora, marked by the crescent and star brand. The words blurred before his eyes. He sank onto the floorboards, letters shaking in his hands. Grace wasn't just any horse. She was Aurora, his wife's lost companion, vanished before they'd met, now returned when everything else was gone. That evening, he carried the letter to the barn. The lantern light spilled gold across the straw, painting the air in warmth and dust. Grace turned her head as he entered, ears pricked. He read the letter aloud, voice unsteady. When he finished, he looked at her through the quiet. "You came back," he whispered. "All this time, and you found your way home." The words hung there, simple and unbelievable. Grace stepped closer until her breast stirred his collar. He rested his forehead against hers, the world narrowing to that single point of warmth. For a long moment, the years fell away, every loss, every silence. She nickered softly, a sound too gentle to belong to anything broken. Outside, snow kept falling, muting every trace of sound. Thomas stayed with her until the lantern burned low, until the cold pressed against the door. When he finally turned to leave, he looked back once more. Grace stood watchful, the faint brand on her flank glinting like firelight through the shadows. Proof that some miracles didn't need believing to be real. Winter loosened its grip slowly, like a hand unclenching after too long in the cold. The snow melted into the soil, and the fields began to breathe again. Thomas stood by the pasture fence, watching Grace, Aurora, move with a strength he hadn't seen before. Her coat gleamed beneath the soft morning light, each motion calm, deliberate, whole. What had arrived half dead now carried herself with quiet pride. He thought of Eleanor, of how she believed that everything lost finds its way back in time. He'd always dismissed it as sentiment, but here she was, her faith made flesh. He rebuilt what the seasons had worn down. The barn roof, the fences, the sign by the gate. He carved a new name into the wood, Moonfire Farm. It felt right, like a promise kept. When neighbors passed and asked why he'd taken in so many strays now, thin horses, a limping dog, an old mule, he only smiled. Because kindness grows if you give it room. They didn't press him further. The farm began to hum again with life, modest and unhurried. Evenings filled with the soft rhythm of chores, the rustle of hay, and the deep, steady sound of Grace's breathing beside him. One afternoon, while clearing a corner of the barn, Thomas found a small sealed envelope wedged behind a beam. It was addressed in Eleanor's looping hand, to the one who finds her. His chest tightened as he unfolded the note. The ink had faded, but her voice seemed to rise from the paper itself, steady, tender, certain. If you ever find Aurora, know that she carries the gentlest part of me. Be kind to her. She'll remind you that love doesn't die. It only changes its shape. He read it twice, then again, the words dissolving into the air like prayer. When he stepped outside, the world was drenched in gold. Grace stood near the fence, mane lifted by the breeze. He walked to her, letter still in his hand. She was right, he murmured. You did bring her back. Grace lowered her head, pressing softly against his shoulder. The gesture needed no translation. Grief had never left him, but it no longer felt like a wound, more like a scar that knew its place. That evening, he opened the pasture gate. Grace trotted forward, then broke into a run, her shadow stretching long across the field. Thomas watched until she was just a shape against the light, free yet still his. The wind carried the scent of thawing earth and something that felt like peace. He thought of Eleanor, of her laughter, of the life that had circled back to him in unexpected form. He smiled faintly and whispered, "Some things find their way home when you stop looking." Then, as twilight settled, he turned toward the farmhouse, the sound of hooves echoing softly behind him. Steady, eternal, whole,